All right, I'm back for part 2 of the 4-part series introducing this channel, the story you find yourself in. And once again, it's predicated on this book that's about to be released. The press release has been approved and to go out shortly. And my goal is to have these 4 videos done prior to that. That's what my marketing representative said I needed to do. So I'm doing it. To get to as I said at the end of the first video, you got to get the beginning right to get the ending right. You got to understand Genesis to understand Revelation. And when I first started writing this book, I had no intention of getting into Revelation. So it's going to be a circuitous route explaining how I got there. And so that's really, there's a beginning to the beginning. And I'm going to go through that. Wife and I are at the beach one day, and we're looking at the waves, and noticed the waves and how they just kept rolling in, and started thinking about the drops, and what they might be experiencing. So it was a surreal moment, and we laughed, and we were having a good time, and we just kind of engaged in a conversation about the drops and creation and what they think of us, and why the water is such great therapy. And so I left thinking, hey, you know what? I was going to write part 2 to the first book, but I think I'm going to write this book first because it kind of intrigued me. And so I got into it, started writing, and it started out as the characters are creation, as I said earlier in the first video, and the main characters are Daiwa, the moon, as the illuminator and the observer of Earth and mankind, and the primary character is Zagula. He's a drop of water. He's the wise old sage drop of water, and he's the only one that has the glow. And you get the glow going on the journey of Saffron when you figure out the secret of the crystal. And that's a belief system that they have to conquer. And Zagula has this unusual energy, but when all the drops are in Mira, the seas, she's the spirit of the 7 seas, they have crystal in them, which is the salt. And when they go on land, they take the journey of Saffron, which is the water cycle. But it's the first experience of consciousness that gets to have a preview of duality. So they go on land, and and their mission is to conquer resistance so that they can find the secret of the crystal and what that is. And when they do that, they get the glow. They get this energy that's just unreal. So Zagula has this energy and doesn't really understand why. But he's the only drop that's been through both the Buddha and through Jesus, of all the drops. And when he went through Jesus, he got this glow. But immediately he was frozen away up in the Himalayas, the eastern spire, and was frozen away just until now. And the creation is having a challenge looking at what mankind's doing to the planet. And they were having a council of concurrence, which is Zaphron the sun and Mother Gaia, the earth, Daiwa the moon, and they were conversing and said, what are we going to do about this? Well, there is this prophecy called the happening that was expected to deal with this situation, and they were suspect that it may be happening. And Mother Gaia, who's been assaulted, was coming in and out of consciousness. She was sometimes awake, sometimes asleep, and which left Mira kind of running rogue, the sea, but left Kalani kind of running rogue on how to deliver the drops and where to deliver the drops, because Kalani wasn't being managed by Gaia. And then Mira started acting irresponsible and a little bit indigent, and just saying, just saying, you're being irresponsible and you're putting a lot of pressure on me. So we had this conflict in the creation. And The unique feature about Zagula, the drop, is they get to discern the thoughts of men. So when they go into a man, or woman, but I'm going to use the word man, then they pick up on all the thoughts, and if they have the glow, they remember those thoughts. But if they don't have the glow, then they forget those thoughts when they come back in the mirror. And so Zagula is the only one that can come back from the journey of Saffron and remember what he experienced inside of man. And he was able to remember Buddha and remember Jesus' thoughts. And so the creation reaches out to get permission from Saffron to say, can we free up Zagula up in the Eastern Spire so that we can have the benefit of his glow and his knowledge? And so they do that. And Zagula arrives, and the entire seven seas, they feel his energy. And Daiwa just can't wait, because since the birth of Jesus, Zagula's been gone, and all he's done is observe mankind. And since that period of time, population has exploded. We've had the Industrial Revolution, we've had the Information Revolution, and we got mankind in disarray. It's fractured, it's disconnected. And Daiwa, all he can do is observe, and he's saying, this whole creation is for the benefit of man. Why is it in such a disarray? Why is it so messed up? What's going on in the head of these men? What are they doing? And the creation acknowledges that everything created on Gaia that's not natural is created by man. So that's tangible and intangible. So when you look at a tangible creation, it's obvious in its construct and its intent. It's designed to make our lives more convenient. And that's really, the stuff you can see, touch, and feel. The intangible are the creations that you can't touch and you can't see. And I focus a lot on ideologies and belief systems and other intangible kind of aspects to man, and they tend to be kind of more central to the whole debate about morality and things like that. And so the first order of business is for the creation to get an assessment of mankind. So that was going to be the intent of this first part of the book. And then they were going to have the happening, which is how the creation basically coerces or manipulates man to be more responsible for the creation and get more symbiotic, have a more symbiotic future. And as I dove into it, I was 40,000 words into writing this book, and I just kept being pulled back into Revelation. I tried to focus on Genesis in the first part, because the creation had to discern, why is man here? How was he created? And they started trying to understand their spiritual nature, so they went into the Bible. They said, hey, let's look at the primary sacred text, and let's draw some comparisons. What does it say, and what are they doing? And let's make some sense of this, because this is their guide. This is their guidebook, and they're practicing religions, all different kinds of religions, and they're pursuing spirituality in a number of different ways. And quite often, Daiwa has observed that these dynamics create conflict. And since the Gula's been, frozen away, there's just been a number of holy wars and what have you, just so much conflict in man. But the population also has gone from 4 million people on the planet to almost 8 billion. When you think about that, put that in context, that is just unreal. How this industrial revolution fueled such a dramatic growth in population, where you could pipe in energy and water and food, and then also take care of the refuse and what have you. And Gaia's just choking on this. She's like, man, the drops are toxic, she's toxic, and they need an answer. They need something to be done about it. And so that's how the book started, and then I just kind of hit a wall, and I just kept being, you got to go to Revelation, because you can't get the beginning right unless you understand the ending. And to be honest with you, never taken Revelation serious. I certainly didn't adhere to the apocalyptic thing that I heard in church and what have you. And that leads me back into a little bit of background on me. Is I was in pretty deep early on in my life and got involved in a very conservative church through my first marriage. It was her family's church. And it had a lot of doctrines that I didn't believe in, but we participated. I have 3 sons, and I wanted them to have that environment. And so we did. And just kind of being the person I was, it's hard for me to get my toe into something and not get involved with leadership of some kind. It's just let me help. And so I became a deacon and started teaching an adult Bible class, and really enjoyed that. And so, religion was a really important part of our life, but then I was asked to consider becoming an elder. I'm 41 when this happened, and I said, being a deacon's one thing, and I basically serve the elders, and I do what the church does, and that's okay. But to be an elder, that's a whole nother level of responsibility, and I had to support, advocate for these doctrines that I just didn't believe in, and I felt like some of them were problematic. But I never really had been forced to put my mind to it and make a decision. Well, at that point, I did. I said, look, I can't do it, and I had to be honest with him. I said, I'm just not there. I don't agree with the way these doctrines affect the pursuit of spirituality. And the whole concept of being saved through a proclamation was also problematic. I said, there's got to be something more. But that jolted me, and I had to make a call. And so I did it. And I can look back now on my life and say that probably was the first clink in the armor that led me ultimately into a midlife crisis event. Just kind of come unhinged when you're forced to make that kind of a call. My entire social structure were folks we went to church with, and other folks that went to other churches. The Christian community. I live in Houston. It's the Bible Belt, and if you step out of those bounds, it's going to cost you, and it did. And as I progressed through it all, I've lost some friends because of it, and even have people that are very, very close to me say, I hate your religion. And I said, well, I don't have the religion to stew. It's just I've acquired a different sort of a belief system than yours, but I still hold Jesus up to be, the greatest man ever lived and our guiding light, but doctrines, I've challenged every single one, and I put them in the book, where I came down on them. But I had to, because when I found the start in Genesis, or where I began my start, and then what I found in Revelation, halfway through my book, I had to go back to the beginning, and I had to rewrite it. And then even as I was rewriting it, I would find another thread or two that I would go back in and have to layer it in there. But ultimately, this is what happened, is I went into Revelation with zero knowledge, so I wasn't encumbered by the indoctrinated interpretation of what it was saying. And as I dove in, I started seeing all these references to Old Testament symbolisms or features. And I went, man, what does all this mean? I mean, there are more Old Testament references in the book of Revelation than any other book. And so I'm going, man, this is really connected to the Old Testament. And at the time, I knew enough about Judaism to go, you know what, it's really, really peculiar that Judaism, they look at Jesus and they say, well, he's not the Messiah. And Christian told him up to be God. And then Paul's he's a lunatic, he hates the Jews, and he invented religion. He's the founder of religion. And then the book of Revelation is dismissed out of hand. It's like, look what the Christians have done with it. And, all that's going to happen. That carnage is going to happen over there in Jerusalem when our Messiah comes. And that's when everything's going to be reconciled and all our enemies are going to be destroyed for good. And so I had to reconcile that in my mind and change the way that I approach the Bible, from beginning to end. And then I found that connection. And it really came together through looking at the book of Hebrews, which I probably have read 20 times prior to that, but I didn't pick up on this symbolism. And it opened up a door for me to see Revelation in a different light. And then some key verses out of Galatians, it just opened another door. And then it just kind of snowballed. And so I found that thread that it works for me. Doesn't mean it's going to work for you. You don't have to agree. But the New Testament is about the inner man. And Jesus demonstrates that for it. He's the perfect idealized man. And he's Christed. And and he was appointed and he was faithful to be that delivery mechanism for us. But there's still the question of who is the Messiah. And then I alluded to it in the first video. I just see Jesus and Christ as being two separate things that brought together gave us what we needed to help guide our way. He showed us the way. And I don't want to get into deep in the weeds right now with that, but it connected. And so I went back to Genesis, and in order to make Revelation work, I had to look at Adam and Eve differently than I was looking at them before. And then it caused me to look at the entire Old Testament differently. And where I came out is I could see the New Testament was all about the inner man. And to make Revelation make sense, it's something that's happening inside each one of us. So it's written for each one of us individually. In Revelation it says, for he who overcomes. And it says that in each of the 7 letters. And then towards the end is for he that wasn't afraid of death. He's going to be my son and I will be his God. So, it shows us from kind of the beginning of the process to the end of the process what it takes to be the Son of God. And in Revelation, it shows us that door, the door that needs to be opened in order for you to go through it. And there's an interesting verse. I think it's beginning of chapter 3, where it's the letter to Church of Sardis, and it says, you're alive and you have a name, but you're dead. And God, my God does not see that your deeds are finished, so wake up. Wake up. And later in that same chapter it says, put on your clothes, put on your garments, because you're naked. You're still naked. And you haven't woken up. And there's other references in the book of Revelation about nakedness. And so nakedness is really, really key because it shows up in the Adam and Eve account. But there's also the serpent. that shows up in the Adam and Eve account, and right off the bat, God says there's going to be enmity between you, the serpent, and you, Eve, you, the woman. And Paul tells us that one thing that Jesus did was he reconciled the two natures into one. He put to death the enmity between those two natures. And so I go back to Genesis and I said, okay, that's the enmity that is being referred to in the New Testament. And I think it's Ephesians where it shows up, maybe Romans. And so those things help connect the dots. And then Paul's references to the Ark of the Covenant in Hebrews and the holy place, where he says, not just a mere copy of the real thing, not a mere copy of the real thing, which is the Old Testament, was a copy of the real thing, not one made with hands, which was the tabernacle, but one made with, by God, the breath of God. And the Ark of the Covenants throughout the Old Testament, it traveled with the Israelites, but it also shows up in a most prominent place in the book of Revelations, which is the point. It's the letter to Sardis that is put into action later on, and it shows up in chapter 11, where the door opened and the Ark of the Covenant appeared. It's the most important connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so that had me going back into the Old Testament and making a determination, what is Adam and Eve? Is the Old Testament an inside game, like the New Testament? And, we all look at the Old Testament and look at it's the physical manifestation of activities and behaviors and outcomes. And the Israelites, they leave Egypt, come out of Egypt, and they travel to the promised land. And ultimately David conquers it, Solomon builds the temple. Well then, there's some corruption that happens, and the Babylonians come in and they destroy Jerusalem, the temple, and the walls. And then later on, Assyria, the Persians, come in and they take out the Babylonians. And that's kind of where the Bible ends, with Jerusalem under the control of the Persians. And one of the visions of Daniel is a ram and a goat, and the goat symbolizes Greece. Well, that foretells of between the Old Testament and the birth of Jesus, Greece conquered the Persians and they took control of Jerusalem. And then 63 BC, roughly, Rome came in and did the same thing to Greece, and they grabbed Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was under the dominion of Rome when Jesus was born and throughout his life. So those are really key markers: Babylonian, Persian, Greece, and Rome. And they do symbolize something that's happening in us. So I went, hey, you know what? I'm going to look at the Bible, the Old Testament, as a picture of something, all these activities that are being exhibited by the Israelites as something that's going on in each one of us. So I looked at Adam and Eve as a single consciousness. And everything that happens throughout the Old Testament, imagine that it's happening to you. That you're that single consciousness going through these experiences where the Israelites take Jerusalem and they think they made it to the promised land, but it gets taken away from them. They didn't have what it took to hold on to it. And that process happens numerous times. I mean, I think Jerusalem's been captured 52 times or something. It's been destroyed twice. It's symbolic. But what's really cool that then much of this stuff has been proven to have actually happened, and so it syncs up. But the story is an inside game in the Old Testament, and it has to be that if you're going to make Revelation make sense. So you have to look at the beginning, Genesis, as Adam and Eve as becoming a single consciousness made in the image of man, because that was made before the body of man was made. And then God took that consciousness and put it into the garden in the body that he had made. And many scholars will equate the Garden of Eden with the Ark of the Covenant. And when you see how Revelation plays out, that's so, is that the Ark of the Covenant is symbolic of the Garden of Eden. And the tree of life is something that is in you. And the tree of life, well, let's go back. The first sin, which isn't sin at all, was partaking of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which was also in the midst of the garden, just like the tree of life. So they're the same tree. It's the dual nature of the tree. And I presuppose that there's a dual nature to the serpent. And like I said earlier in the first video, it's Nakash and Meshiach, the name for the serpent and for the Messiah, have the same numerical value in Hebrew, two sides of the same coin. And we start out in that serpent persona, which is the natural body that Paul talks about, and our objective is to evolve into the spiritual body. And that's going from the serpent persona to the Christed persona, and it's an inside game. And as you look at the Old Testament in that context, the 7 nations of Canaan correlate to the 7 spiritual centers in your body in terms of the characteristics of those particular components. Now, all that goes back to Eastern religions, but they sync up perfectly. And the lowest one's associated with the earth, the second one is water, the third one's fire, and the fourth one is air. And that's there's a lot of connections between those two. And so the tree of life is representative of your spinal column and those 7 spiritual centers located in your body, and collectively that's your mind, because you have thoughts that are generated out of each one of those. And the 7 nations of Canaan represent those characteristics. So, and I'll kind of finish with this, going back to the Bible, the God of the Old Testament, people would say, how do you reconcile the God of the Old Testament? He's so angry and he has the Israelites kill everybody. And then the God of the New Testament is so different. Well, when you look at symbolically, the 7 nations of Canaan, they represent in some capacity error thoughts that are generated out of these different centers. They're either related to thriving and surviving, material gain, sexual desire, power, influence. And all those thoughts originate in kind of in a different place, and then they come through your heart center. And if you don't have it guarded, those thoughts really are subconscious, and they end up in a reaction, in a display of action of some sort that wasn't really thought through, because your heart center doesn't have a wall around it. When you become Christed, you do have that wall, and those thoughts, those error thoughts, they just can't come rushing up through that grand central station. And that gives you pause. You're looking out over the wall and you're saying, you know what, I'm going to think about that thought. I'm either going to give it credence or I'm not, but I'm not going to react to it. And I'm not going to let it just come in without some discernment and wreak havoc on everything else. And that's so symbolic to what happened in Nehemiah when he came in and rebuilt the wall, and who they allowed back in and why. Because every name that they allowed back in has a symbolic meaning to it. And every name that they didn't allow back in had a symbolic meaning to it. So, to get to the beginning, just know I'm looking at it in that context, because that's the only way I can make it work. And I think that's the only way that you can make Genesis connect with Revelation. So that's part one to the beginning. And then the next one, I'll get into the actual beginning. But I'll finish with this. And this could be the theme of my book. And I wished I had honed in on it earlier, but I just didn't. I had read the Gospel of Thomas once prior, reading my book, and I just didn't hone in on it. But it's one of the Gnostic Gospels, and it wasn't allowed into the canon. And when you read it, I think I know why. I mean, you can't hold the narrative that the Roman Catholic Church started with this in there, because this just throws a monkey wrench in the whole thing. But verse number 18, the disciples said to Jesus, "Tell us how our end will come." So they're saying, "Hey man, what's the end game? What's going to happen here?" You can almost imagine Jesus answering a bit sarcastically, just with a little bit of humor. Jesus said, "Have you found the beginning then, that you were looking for the end? You see, the end will be where the beginning is. Congratulations to the one who stands at the beginning. That one will know the end and will not taste death." Then the beginning of the next verse, Jesus said, "Congratulations to the one who came into being before coming into being." And therein lies the secret. Just like the drops in the creation, they begin in mirror and they go back to mirror. We begin somewhere and we go back to the same place. And we realize that and we see that in a lifetime, in an incarnation. It's not something that we wait for till the end, afterlife, and it's something that's revealed to us. Revelation shows the process of waking up, coming into consciousness. And that's the point where you arrive at the beginning. And it also correlates to the whole concept that I mentioned in the first video. Jesus says, "You look at those nursing babies, you got to be like them to enter the kingdom of heaven." Well, those little babies, it's before they've developed all the characteristics of the ego self, of the serpent persona, and been corrupted. And to get into the kingdom of heaven, you've got to see that guy. In 2 Thessalonians, I think verse 4, you got to see the apostasy before the Christ does what he's going to do. And that gets back to that verse from chapter 3, the church of Sardis, when he says, "You have a name, you're alive, but you're dead, and you need to wake up." And every lamb has a name, right? We all read that stuff. But it's a narrow gate. So he's telling this guy, whoever's, you reading Revelation, you may have a name, and you're alive, but you're spiritually dead. You haven't woken up yet. Your deeds aren't finished in the sight of my God. You need to wake up and put on your clothes. You need to cover your nakedness. You're unaware of your own unconsciousness. And that's what those verses mean. Deep stuff, but that's where I'm going with it. And so the next video, maybe I'm going to have maybe I'm going to have probably a fifth introduction, because I want to get into, I'm going to have one devoted to the imagery. So the next one's going to be getting to the beginning, Adam and Eve. The next one is going to be the end. And then the last one I'm going to focus on just an overview of the imagery, so that we can all have a baseline then to approach the rest, the entirety of it, and start looking at these really cool stories that connect and what it means to us. And I think that'll do it for this one. So hang in there. Thanks for watching. It's kind of funny. I don't have anybody subscribed yet, but my hope is when the book goes live that there'll be some interest and somebody will show up and watch this. Right now, I'm talking to not really anybody. Thank you so much. Bye.